Folks, welcome to week 4. I'll talk about Putnam first, and then I will do the Tractatus. So you will have some lecture support. Sorry I'm late this week. Just this weekend kind of got away from me. Okay, so first Putnam, and before Putnam, Quine. Putnam's article is fantastic. It contains this wonderful thought experiment about Oscar and Twin Earth, and he uses it to illustrate the concept of externalism. So externalism is the idea that meaning comes from the external world, not inside the head. And he begins the article by mentioning an article by Quine that you haven't read yet. Quine comes up with this fantastic example against externalism. So Quine, in arguing for internalism, the idea that meanings are in the head, comes up with this notion of chordates and renates, or as you might know them better, creatures with a heart, chordates, and creatures with kidneys, renates. So it turns out that chordates and renates are always the same creature because hearts and kidneys evolved together. So whenever I am pointing at anything in the field, a zebra, a cow, a bird, right? If it has a heart, it has kidneys, and if it has kidneys, it has a heart. And yet, if you ask me, hey, that zebra, what does that mean? What is that animal? Is it a chordate or is it a renate? Well, it's always both, right? So this kind of harkens back to the Gavagai problem of Quine, where it's like, well, they mean two different things by chordate and renate, but if I don't have the equipment to cut up the critter and find out, here's the heart and here are the kidneys, they always have the same extension, and yet they have different cognitive values. Therefore, for Quine, internalism is true. They have different cognitive values. Well, heavens to Betsy, Putnam disagrees. This is one of the great jokes in philosophy, is that Quine and Putnam both worked down the hall in Harvard, at Harvard for many, many years, and instead of talking to each other, they just published against one another for their entire very successful careers. So Putnam comes in with this wonderful example to illustrate externalism and extensionality, and it's twin Earth. It's just like Earth. It's got doppelgangers of me and you and this dude called Oscar, and that's what he's going to talk about. So here on Earth, the word water refers to H2O, but on twin Earth, water refers to another chemical compound called XYZ. So phenomenally, they are the same, right? So think about the word phenomena. And go Husserl if you have any Husserl in your background. So just in terms of our basic experience, they are completely the same. These liquids are things that we need to stay alive, that we drink, that we bathe in, that are essential to our blood and our composition. And yet here it's H2O and there it's XYZ. So this raises the question, does the word water have the same meaning on Earth and on twin Earth? So if you're an internalist, you're going to say yes, because you're pointing to the phenomena. Externalists are going to say no, it points to the object. Putnam's position famously is meanings just ain't in the head. So it's not about the cognitive inner meaning, it's about the external correlate or referent of a word or a proposition or a phrase, etc. Notice my definitions on this slide of intension and extension before we move forward. I do slash out, maybe we're talking about words, maybe we're talking about sentences, maybe we're talking about propositions or phrases or clauses or parts of words, like a theist means not a theist, right? So I want to leave that ambiguous for now because people get into huge knockdown drag-out fights over what kind of thing is the most important. Is the word the cornerstone of a language? Is a sentence the cornerstone of a language, or a phrase or a clause or a piece of a word, right? A phoneme or a morpheme. So I'm going to leave that part blank, and we're just going to focus on whether meaning, whatever it is the meaning of, is intentional or extensional. So Putnam gives us a historical example to help us out. I don't think we need the historical example to get it because we already know that we experience water as a colorless, odorless liquid. But he says, come on, man, that's what we're all pointing to until we get advanced chemistry, until we get science. And then suddenly we point to other things. Likewise, right, molybdenum, I'm such a bad chemistry person, molybdenum and aluminum really look alike. So you and I could not tell the difference between molybdenum and aluminum pots and pans, but a scientist could, a metallurgist could. Likewise, he says that he confesses that he doesn't really know the difference between a beech and an elm, right? Different kinds of trees. And I confess I don't either. Jerry Fodor writes a whole book on this, which I had to sign for the class, The Elm and the Expert. It's based on this example. It's like, beeches, elms, I don't know. I'd have to go get a tree person and that tree expert could explain it to me, but I don't know the difference. So when I'm pointing to something, it seems like there is something going on in my head that is vague or is based on my experience only and not on any deeper knowledge. So he uses these different examples, the historical example of chemistry advancing and these other examples to give us this argument that extension or reference or the external world has something very important to do with meaning. In this article, he dares go so far as to say that it's like fundamentally determining. In other articles, he backs off a little bit, but he never lets go of this notion that extensionality is really important, things that are outside the head. We can't just stipulate that Oscar on Earth and Oscar on Twin Earth are talking about exactly the same thing when they're talking about water, as much as we might want to. So one of the objections that Putnam considers is this sort of objection from physicalism, right? If we're going to take the word doppelganger seriously and the words twin Earth seriously, then my doppelganger has to have exactly the same kinds of substances that I do, right? My doppelganger has to be made of the same stuff, physically reducible to the same stuff, and if it's really a doppelganger, then he must be having my thoughts or she must be having my thoughts. Sorry, I'm very bad at gender. I just think that, it's not of concern in this case, but so she must be having my thoughts. However, right, if I say water and I'm here on Earth, I do mean H2O. But if Sarah number 2 is on twin Earth, she has to mean XYZ. That's part of, right, the meaning of the word is referring to the chemical compound. And yet, right, Putnam points out we have these blurry concepts. Who can explain the difference between a beech and an elm? Only a very few of us. And with this, Putnam brings in one of Wittgenstein's concepts that words are a cooperative tool used by many people at the same time. And sometimes they vaguely refer because that is the function that they are asked to perform in a society. So words function in sort of a vague way that is based on how people use them, and how people use them, he decides conclusively, is about the external world. And he explores Kripke's notion of rigid designator, but he comes back to that same point. So he says, okay, we could stipulate it to be different. So we could say that maybe water is the word that rigidly designates certain properties, like that it's a colorless, odorless liquid that is essential to life, right? Maybe it rigidly designates those, but not chemical composition. And then he says, but, Kripke, you've got a really nice theory with your rigid designators, but it doesn't map onto how we use the word. Because if we discovered that, here we are on twin Earth and we're exploring and we think that we're looking at H2O, and in fact we're looking at XYZ, we would still say, oops, I mistook XYZ for water. So by observing how we use the word, we discover that meanings are not in the head. So dismissal of Kripke, dismissal of Quine in this article. Got a cat here, so I don't know how it's going to go. And Moon seems to really want to participate in the lecture. I just wanted to put out one extra point about Putnam, which is also notice that this is, in a sense, a causal dubbing sort of theory of meaning, because it is about external objects and what we call them. And so it's not really a description theory. Or is it? I recognize that this article is complex for the 4.5 pages that it is, and that we might need to come back to it, but I want to move on to Wittgenstein right now. Just know that we might end up talking about Putnam next week as well.